Welcome to SST8's series on supporting diverse learners. This webinar will focus on a framework that can be used to identify and address students' unfinished learning when planning upcoming lessons or units, and what you can do as a teacher, teacher team, or instructional leader to impact student learning. The intent of this webinar is for teacher-based teams, individual teachers, building leaders, or building level teams to view and discuss this content while providing flexibility in meeting your professional development needs. For example, you may choose to chunk the content and break it up over multiple days, or you may wish to use it as part of a professional development day. To assist with your learning and team discussions, please be sure to access digitally or download and print a copy of the accompanying resource document. The three-step framework we will be addressing during this webinar asks teachers and teams to understand, diagnose, and take action as you look to address unfinished learning. So let's get started. During this webinar, participants can expect to consider the terms unfinished learning and unfinished teaching and the impact each of these has on student learning. We'll also become familiar with the three steps in the understand, diagnose, take action framework and the flexibility that the framework allows. And participants will learn the important role that deconstructing standards plays in this framework. The information in this webinar comes from a variety of research. Much of the information presented, though, comes from the following sources: Achieve the Core and their aligned blog, the Achievement Network, the PLC Plus Better Decisions and Greater Impact by Design book by Fisher, Fry, Almarode, Flores, and Nagel, and the Teacher Clarity Playbook by Fisher, Fry, Amador, and Azov. You will find links to Achieve the Core in the aligned blog, as well as the Achievement Network on your resource document. Before we take a look at what we can do to address unfinished learning, let's talk about what it is. Unfinished learning refers to any prerequisite knowledge, foundational skills, procedural skills and fluency, or application of concepts that students need for future work that they don't have yet. But not all unfinished learning has the same effect on students' ability to access grade level content. In some cases, it will simply require more time or effort from students, that additional time to practice or time to develop a deeper understanding with the ability to apply their knowledge. While on the other hand, there may be situations that require prerequisite knowledge for entry or access into a lesson or task. In a case where students lack prerequisite knowledge or skills, a teacher may need to add one or more lessons to address the gap before moving into grade level content. When we refer to material that has been previously covered, but that not all students have mastered, the term unfinished learning came about as a way to show the potential for growth and learning instead of focusing on the negative. This type of thinking models a growth mindset rather than a deficit mindset, which is an important step for teachers and leaders in supporting all students. While unfinished learning describes that students have not yet completed their learning, unfinished teaching shifts the focus to educators and what we can do differently that will lead to a greater impact for student learning. We begin to ask the questions: where are we now? Where are we going? How do we move learning forward? Who benefited from our instruction and who did not? And what do we need to think about now? How can we, as educators, transform the way we think about addressing unfinished learning through the lens of examining highly effective instruction in our teacher teams? Teacher teams can ask, have we ensured that our instruction aligns to grade level standards and expectations? And have we looked at different evidence-based practices and strategies that work for specific groups of students? One way to examine effective instruction is to consider evidence-based strategies. Let's take a quick look at one example of an evidence-based strategy that has been found to work with specific groups of students that teacher teams might want to research further. Reciprocal teaching is an effective strategy to utilize when students are having difficulty with making meaning and comprehension. The research found reciprocal teaching to be effective with all students, but specifically students with disabilities, English learners, and bilingual students. This is a deep learning strategy with an effect size of 0.74, and it is a structured reading routine where each participant has a specific task: summarizing, questioning, clarifying, or predicting. The key for teachers and teacher teams is to find those specific strategies that specifically address identified student needs for specific groups of students. For maximum impact, we need to consider both unfinished learning and unfinished teaching. If we only look at what students are doing, we are only seeing half of the picture. We need to become more curious and ask ourselves, why is it that some students haven't yet mastered material? And what can we as teachers and leaders do differently to give our students their best chance to succeed? Our best opportunity comes when we examine what we as educators can do to specifically address identified student needs. Do some students need additional time and practice? Or do we need to fill gaps so students have an entry point to access grade level expectations? And as we are planning instruction, are we asking ourselves what strategies might work best to address the identified need? And have we ensured that our lessons align to the expectations of the standards? Throughout this webinar, we will begin to take a look at these questions and what you can do for maximum impact. But before we move on, let's take a moment to reflect on this idea of maximum impact. At this time, locate the Quick Write section on your resource document. Pause the webinar and take time to respond to the prompt, and then discuss your thoughts as a team. When your team is ready to move on, please resume the webinar. Reflecting on unfinished learning and teaching is an important first step in moving forward. So let's start with what we know. We know that all students deserve access to grade level content, and that if we don't address unfinished learning, the gaps only get bigger. And all students are at different places in their learning, which leads us to this: the constant struggle. When planning instruction, you probably ask yourself, should I keep moving forward because we have so much to cover? Or should I stop and take time to fill all of the gaps and build prerequisite knowledge? At this time, pause the webinar again and reflect or discuss where you are with this struggle. Where do you tend to land, and what helps you decide where to go? Once you have finished your reflection or discussion, resume the webinar. Your conversations probably addressed a few different thoughts and ideas, but there is one place to begin that will assist you in your planning. We need to start with the standards. When looking at the standards and thinking about unfinished learning, you will need to consider whether you will be focusing on intervention or access. We need to know what our focus is in order to provide the necessary instruction for all learners to be able to meet those grade level mastery of standards. When you are planning with your team or considering adjustments for an upcoming lesson, ask yourself if you are including extra time and focus on teaching a foundational skill that will connect to and support all students in meeting grade level standards? Or do you need to determine specific entry points into the lesson for some students so that all students can access the content and be successful? It is important to keep in mind that the goal is to assist and support all students in learning grade level content. Although intervention versus access can sometimes be difficult to determine, the key is to keep those expectations high. We all know that having high expectations for each student is critical. We must also have high expectations in the belief that each student has the right to learn grade level standards. But just how critical is it that we as educators have high expectations? Consider this. Students will be at a disadvantage if teachers aren't teaching to the depth and rigor of those grade level standards. Access to grade level content must be happening every single day in every single classroom for every single student. If teachers are always going backward to cover content, students will never move forward in learning and will never reach those grade level standards. Follow along as I read and reflect on this quote from Fullen and Gallagher in their 2020 book, The Devil is in the Details: System Solutions for Equity, Excellence, and Student Wellbeing. Too often in school, we love our students and give them lots of support, but we don't give them high aspirations. Without ever realizing it, we lower our expectations of what they can do, and out of concern and kindness, we lower our teaching expectations so they can succeed. And at the end of the term or year or their school career, we conclude that these are wonderful children, but they didn't accomplish as much as other students, never realizing that even if they had learned well everything that we taught, they would still fall short because we didn't dream big enough dreams with them. Ask yourself, what could these students accomplish if we challenged and supported them in the right ways in rising to the challenge? Better yet, how do we do this? These questions remind me of this feeling. Have you ever found yourself in a situation with a broken down vehicle? Being stuck and without obvious solutions can be a helpless feeling, especially when you don't know where to start and what to do. So what do you do when something like this occurs? Call and reach out for help, utilize your resources, make a plan. Pause and reflect for a moment to recall a time when this is how you felt after teaching a lesson. The questions, possibilities, and solutions for consideration sometimes seem very overwhelming. But once you stop, gain some clarity and guidance, and start to make a plan, you can begin to approach instruction so that you are able to work smarter, not harder. And this is where a framework can provide individuals and teams structure and guidance in addressing that unfinished learning. As you work to address your concerns and questions, you will need to lift that hood, do a little inspection, and make a plan to help all students succeed. The framework that we will consider throughout this webinar is the Understand, Diagnose, Take Action approach. The remainder of this specific webinar will focus primarily on the Understand section of this framework. We will discuss the importance of studying and focusing on standards for upcoming instruction and identifying critical prerequisite skills that students will need in order to access grade level content. The Diagnose and Take Action steps will be addressed in additional content-specific webinars for literacy and math following this webinar. There is, however, one important note to keep in mind regarding this framework. It is not necessarily linear in nature, starting at the top. Although all aspects of the framework are important pieces, the double arrows between the words understand, diagnose, and take action indicate that where you start and the order in which you proceed can change depending on where you are in the process of determining next steps for instruction. As we begin to dive into the understand section of this framework, we will look at the what and how of designing instruction for all students. You will want to consider how your conversations in your TBT or PLC meetings will change, what core Tier 1 instruction will look like, and how you can leverage an intervention or enrichment period to increase student success in meeting those grade level standards. How do you and your teacher team study the standards for upcoming lessons? And how do you identify critical prerequisite skills and understand what students need to access grade level content? If we think back to our broken down vehicle analogy, the first step in understanding what happened is by looking at the vehicle and how it was designed and built to operate. A mechanic knows and understands the blueprints and designs of a variety of vehicles so they can make adjustments and get them back on the road. When it comes to instruction, our blueprints are the standards, and we need to study them so that we have clarity around how they were intentionally built, as well as the expectations and the standards for what students should be able to understand, know, and do, so we can help them get back on that road to learning. The first step in gaining that clarity so that we can best design our instruction is by having a true understanding of the standards. Identifying the expectations for learning in the standards helps develop our understanding of what students should know and be able to do. Only by having clarity ourselves can we create and share learning targets and intentions for students in a language they will understand. One method to gain clarity around a standard is to deconstruct or unpack the standard. Deconstructing standards helps us to gain knowledge about the entirety and complexity of what is being asked of students. Do you and your team have these conversations? How do you and your team gain clarity around the standard to ensure consistency among and across grade levels? Pause the webinar now to consider the work you and your team do around deconstructing standards to gain clarity, and resume the webinar when you have finished your discussion. When we talk about clarity, we need to consider, do we as teachers understand the standard, including the expectations of the standard? And a second layer to this question is, have we determined the rigor and depth of knowledge expected within that standard? Knowing the standards well allows you to identify the necessary prior knowledge and determine the expectations for student success. Because of the complexity of the standards, a simple glance through the standards document is not sufficient to gain this understanding and to design your instruction. There are many considerations when deconstructing a standard. We will talk through one example and then provide you an opportunity to deconstruct a standard as a team. We'll start by using a 6th grade reading informational text standard. Standard 8 expects students to be able to trace and evaluate the argument and specific claims in a text, distinguishing claims that are supported by reasons and evidence from claims that are not. As you and your team begin to break down a standard, you will also want to look at the extended standards and learning progressions to assist with determining access points if necessary. You will see on this slide, as you look from right to left, the ladder of learning progressions and the increase in complexity levels as they build toward grade level expectations. It is important to use this information to support your understanding of how the standard was designed and built as you determine the concepts and academic language included in the standard, which was usually represented by the nouns, as well as the skills outlined in the standard, which tend to be the verbs. Starting with the grade level standard, we can begin to pull out the concepts and academic language by looking for those nouns. In this case, we find the terms argument, claim, reason, and evidence. It is important to remember that these are the terms that will need to be explicitly taught for students to demonstrate mastery of the skill. These terms and concepts are the what of the standard. Then we begin to pull out the skills by finding the verbs: trace, evaluate, and distinguish. If we follow each of these verbs one at a time, we can see that the students are expected to be able to trace the argument and specific claims in a text, evaluate the argument and specific claims in a text, and distinguish between supported and unsupported claims. When considering fully teaching this standard, you and your team would think of these skills as the how of the standard. This is how students will demonstrate mastery of this standard. Once you and your team have unpacked the standard, it is important to look back at the learning progressions and extended standards to determine if there are additional concepts or skills that students are missing or that need to be included in your instruction. We will talk more about this in the diagnose and take action steps of the framework. But right now, let's take a look at a few examples of deconstructing standards from a variety of grade levels in math and English language arts. Our first example is from grade 1 math. Feel free to pause the webinar to discuss or allow the video to play and continue on to the next example. Please note that none of the examples provided should be taken as the one correct answer. As you look at each of the examples, decide whether you agree with what is written or if your team would make any adjustments or changes. This is an example from grade 4 English language arts. Again, feel free to pause the webinar to discuss or allow the video to play and continue on to the next example. On this slide, you will see an example for algebra. Once again, feel free to pause or allow the video to play and continue on to our final example. And in this example, we have 10th grade English. What are you thinking now? Where are your discussions taking you and your team? Right now, it's your turn to apply your knowledge and deconstruct a standard of your own. At this time, locate the independent practice section on your resource document. As a team, decide if you would like to deconstruct a standard from one of your own upcoming lessons, or you can choose to use the 7th grade ELA standard or 3rd grade math standard provided on your resource document. At this time, pause the webinar and as a team, practice deconstructing the standard you choose. When you are finished, please resume the webinar. We are going to pause right now to allow time for personal reflection and for you to make some connections to your current work. Find the time to process section on your resource document and take some time as an individual to think and write, and then turn and talk as a team. Pause the webinar, and when you are ready to move on, press play. During the time remaining in this webinar, we will briefly discuss the diagnose and take action parts of the framework. However, there are additional webinars that will be available that will go more in depth in these two areas for mathematics and literacy specifically. But for now, let's move on to the second section of the framework, diagnose. As you are diagnosing where students are in the mastery of the standards, you will need to gather evidence of learning. This may come in the form of student work examples or data. During this section of the framework, you examine your evidence and data to identify an individual's or a group's specific areas of weakness and strength. This step will guide you to determine the correct actions to take as you are planning for instruction. When possible, use data you already have to diagnose students' understanding and learning in order to save yourself time and avoiding over-testing students. See what you can learn from classroom discussions, one-on-one conversations, and written work students complete as part of everyday instruction. You may have data from formative assessments, summative or unit assessments, and maybe even some benchmarking assessments. If more information is needed, you may decide to administer a pre-assessment. The question is, do you have the right information to diagnose where students are in their learning? The third section of the framework is take action. This is where you put your plan into action. You may have worked on deconstructing the standards or collected evidence and data and are now ready to make the following determination in regards to your instruction. With whom will you need to address unfinished learning? When will this support take place? On what skills or concepts will you need to focus? And how will you go about it? What tools, resources, and strategies will support the task? You are ready to maximize your impact with your instructional decisions. Let the data be your guide as you decide what specific actions to take. Does the entire class, a group of students, or an individual student need extra time and support in learning? When is the best time for these actions? During core instruction or during an intervention time? What specifically needs addressed in order for all students to have access to the lesson and grade level content? And how will you address the identified learning needs? What evidence-based strategies work best with the student or students that need that additional support? In the end, there is no magic spell. There is no one program or solution to catching kids up who might be several years behind. Instead, it takes deep content knowledge, increased time, and strategic planning to meet students where they are, accelerate their path forward, and get them on the road to learning. In other words, it takes you. While the three-step approach of understand, diagnose, take action will not magically finish students' unfinished learning, it can provide some structure to a challenge many teachers continue to face in the classroom. Thank you for watching and listening. And until next time, remember that what you do matters every day as you make a difference for all of your students.